The story of Subject X is one I am very curious to see develop in the future of the series. Finding out who Subject X is and where exactly she's at now, as well as her current mental state, are all things I'd like to know more about. In the last 3 years since Kingdom Hearts 3's release, there have been numerous theories about Subject X's identity, including my own where I discussed how I believe her current state in the timeline might play into her future position in the series. But based on some new information revealed by Nomura during the 20th anniversary, I want to now focus a bit more on her untold past relationships with Lee and Isa, and how this led to the formation of Isa's notorious scar.
I thought this was all for her.
In the Q&A segment of the 20th anniversary event, Nomura discussed many things which have been worth making note of, but one of them in particular that stood out to me was his reply to the question of if we'd learned the story behind Isa's scar, to which he answered that there is a story regarding Lee and Isa and the girl they tried to save. Since there is a backstory there, we are thinking of expanding on it. We hope you can look forward to it. This is obviously in reference to the girl Lee and Isa talk about in Kingdom Hearts 3, the same girl that mentions in the secret reports that her only solace was the time she'd spend talking with 2 boys from time to time, and of course, that very same girl is Subject X. It is explained in the secret reports that Lee and Isa would often sneak into the castle but would be caught and thrown out by the guards until eventually one day they successfully snuck inside and found a girl in a cell there. After conversing with her over time, eventually they both desired to free her, especially Lee, but at some point they found she was no longer there and they decided the only way to know for certain what happened to her was to become apprentices to Ansem the Wise. Sometime after becoming apprentices, they eventually lost their hearts and became nobodies, leading to the creation of Saix and Axel, who would go on to make their plans to take over the organization from the inside.
I can handle all the dirty work. You go all the way to the top.
However, during this time, their relationship grew strained. As they spent more time in the organization, they both lost sight of their original purpose, with both of them becoming more consumed by the darkness, willing to be harsh and fairly sadistic. However, in Axel's case, he had befriended Roxas and Shion, and that had saved him from being fully consumed, but all this did for Saix was push him even deeper into the dark, his envy fueling his rage. He felt as though Axel had forgotten their true purpose, their original desire to save Subject X.
You have changed. Does the past mean nothing to you?
Whilst this all explains why they were in the organization and why their friendship changed from how it was in Birth by Sleep, we still don't know the reason for Isa's scar, and yes, I mean Isa and not Saix, because we see after his recompletion, Isa still has the scar, meaning that he must have gotten it before he became a nobody, yet sometime after we see him in Birth by Sleep, since at that point he doesn't have it yet. But something we also don't know anything about is why exactly is he a berserker? Why is it when he goes into that mode, the scar on his face grows larger? If Nomura intends to explore the story behind the subject and the scar, then these are some questions I'd expect to be answered. But if I had to speculate, whilst there's a number of possibilities, there's 3 in particular that I am personally leaning towards.
Your flesh bears the sigil, so your name shall be known as that of a recusant.
The first possibility is that Isa was branded with the scar by apprentice Xehanort shortly after becoming an apprentice, but before he became a nobody, meaning Xemnas wouldn't have been the one to give it to him, despite him being the one speaking about the flesh bearing the sigil and being a recusant. The funny thing about that line is that the only character whose flesh actually bears the sigil is Isa, while Sora only ever had it on his clothes. I believe Isa may well have been marked by apprentice Xehanort as being a specific chosen vessel to become part Xehanort, since at some point he was Norted, hence the eye colour and the pointy ears, both of which we see he no longer has when he's recompleted. But also, the recusant part would mean that he was unwilling to submit to authority. If this is true, then the question becomes, why was he specifically marked with the X and Lee wasn't? The answer may lie in that berserker ability of his. If something happened, perhaps something related to Lee that put him in danger, then perhaps this event triggered an early form of this berserker power of his, and upon witnessing this power, Xehanort may have taken a particular interest in him. I can specifically see him discovering the plan by apprentice Xehanort that would result in them losing their hearts, and in an effort to protect both himself and Lee from that fate, he turns against them and goes berserk in the process, and of course he is ultimately defeated and is marked with the sigil scar. and they're knotted so that over time he would grow to become more like Xehanort. This would explain why he becomes a lot darker and a lot harsher of a person than he seemed to be before that. Another possibility is that he gave himself the scar accidentally. This could be as simple as him training his berserk power, and perhaps as a potential side effect of this power he gains the scar, because again the scar does enlarge when he goes berserk, which strongly implies it has some sort of connection to that power. If this is the case, since he didn't have the scar in Birth by Sleep, we can assume that at that point he'd not gone berserk before. But the other side of this is the third possibility, which is that he did it to himself intentionally. I would assume he marked himself specifically with an X, since that's the only name he had to remember the girl by. If it was intentional, it was probably something that was done as a way for him to ensure he wouldn't ever forget the past, and perhaps that's why when they became nobodies he remembers Subject X seemingly a lot more than Axel does, or at the very least it seems he values the connection they made with her more. If it was something he did to himself on purpose, it doesn't really answer why the scar enlarges when he goes berserk. It could be a mixture of the two. So let's say that the scar appears unintentionally when he goes berserk, but instead of completely removing it, he decides to keep it there for the sake of remembrance of his purpose. Or perhaps that detail about how the scar connects to his berserk mode isn't as important as I'm thinking it is, but personally I'm struggling to see how it isn't, given the fact it's a detail that was deliberately shown to us, and Nomura is acknowledging that there's a story to this scar that he'd like to expand on. So surely even if he didn't have a clear reason for why the scar changes at first, it seems sensible to think he'll have a reason for it now. If I could choose which of these three would be the option, well firstly I wouldn't pick any of them. In fact, if it were up to me, I'd have it be Subject X herself that did it to him, as a way of displaying how her mind has been manipulated by Luxu to make her into a new weapon for their side to wield. However, since that's almost certainly not going to happen, I will say that of these three options, I'd prefer it was the first. I think Apprentice Xehanort being the one to do it, especially given his obsession with darkness and the sigil, and using it to mark those that he wants to become his vessels, is something that fits perfectly with all the pre-established lore of this series. Also, I'm going to be so bold as to say, I actually think that is what the original intention of Saix's story was. If anything, I think he would have originally been Subject X, but because Nomura of course wants to tie the key saga characters into the present timeline, Saix's story I believe probably got a bit of a soft retcon, and now he's simply associated with Subject X rather than being Subject X himself. And that's why, despite the fact I'd rather it was Xehanort that gave him that scar, I do believe what we'll actually get in the end is indeed Saix intentionally branding himself with it. It just seems, based on how things have been written so far, that there's a lot of emphasis between Lee and Isa in regards to memories and not forgetting people. To further add to that theme, and to in some way provide a potential reason as to why Saix was able to remember Subject X, especially since remembering her seems to be something that's being played up to be specifically quite important to him. It seems like this is the most likely route they take to demonstrate all of that, and I can see the Isa and Scold ships coming from a mile off. God help us all. Now, whilst there's some grey area to be discussed in just how they go about showing it, since literally Saix carving a cross on his face might be a bit too much for Kingdom Hearts, I think they could find a way to do it, though whether or not they should take this route, well, that's a discussion I'll leave for the comment section. Whatever they choose to pick, I'm just looking forward to finally getting some closure on this particular part of the story, and whilst I'm not sure whether we'll be getting it in Kingdom Hearts 4 or sometime after that, it's something I'm willing to wait to finally see, and hopefully the wait will be worth it. Originally, when making this video, I was going to go into more depth about why I believe Scold could have given Isa the scar, but after doing a little research, it's quite blatantly obvious that wouldn't be very likely given the timeline of events. For those of you who might be wondering why I'd even suggest that, it's related to my thoughts on Scold basically replacing Ava, and if you don't know much about that, then check out my video I did on it last year. As per usual, I of course have more theories to cover, and whilst not all of them will come out as swiftly as this one did, they'll be coming sooner rather than later. Next up, however, is going to be a video that has absolutely nothing to do with Kingdom Hearts, and one that is long overdue. If you like anime and you like Star Wars, then perhaps my next video will be something you'll find particularly interesting. But until then, my name is NextGenNovelist, and that's all I've got to say, and I'm out. Peace.